Well, it is my pleasure to present at this conference, and I greatly appreciate the efforts of the organizers of this conference. I think it's a great event and probably one, if not the best, academic conference in economics that we had in Kyiv for a long time. Anyway, today I will present a paper that I have done with several co-authors on property rights, protection of property rights, and investment in agriculture and land use in agriculture. It is work in progress, so I will appreciate your comments and questions, and I hope that I will be able to improve this work upon your comments. I will talk a little bit about the institutional environment that we have in agricultural sector. I will touch on the issues of uncertainty of property rights and moratorium and other things that we have in agriculture, and we will consider the model that explains how the uncertainty and how the insecurity of property rights may lead to underinvestment in agriculture and what consequences they may have. Then we test this hypothesis empirically and discuss the results and policy implications. So, why the case of Ukrainian agriculture and protection of property rights is important both from policy but also from academical reasons? Well, as we all well aware, Ukraine plays more and more important role in global food security, in provision of food to the global markets, and for that matter, productivity of Ukrainian agriculture, growth in productivity in agricultural sector is important not only from the local perspective but also from the global perspective. And another interesting thing about Ukrainian agriculture is that unlike many other countries, we seem to have constraints in productivity growth that are not related to a poor climate or poor soils, but rather to the institutional environment that we currently have in our country. And we address specifically this issue in this paper, and we try to see how improvements or changes in the institutional environment may have effect on the choice of crops, on the investment decisions, and so on. And we argue that addressing the issues of institutional insecurity would lead to growth in productivity and investment in agriculture, and by doing reforms, by addressing this insecurity, would also contribute to the issues of global food security. Well, Ukraine has a very diverse agricultural sector, both geographically in terms of the climate conditions, and Ukrainian agriculture, like agriculture in many other countries, faces the same risks of weather variability, of price fluctuations, particularly because we are connected to the global markets. But the issue of uncertainty with protection of property rights is something unique and something that we can explore in this paper. But and we look at the period of time between 2004 and 2012, where we start seeing the consequences of the moratorium on sales of agricultural land. Over this time, Ukraine has developed a rental market, and we saw very strong growth in productivity. We saw a major change in crop mix, and we saw emergence of super large farms or agri-holdings. So whether this dynamic is affected by the institutional setting, and how that's something that we explore in our paper. Well, talking about the crop mix, over the period of time that we consider for this paper, we observe that we look in this paper. We look at several crops. The most common crops that are grown by agricultural producers, and these are the grains. And we see that the share of grains is more or less stable over this period of time, about 46 to 50%. But also we observe a strong growth in the oil crops, in oil seeds, and all of you have seen various references to this point. But one interesting thing is that the share of perennial crops, which we also consider for this research, is stable at a very low level, about 1%, even below 1% of share of land use. And this fact is a little bit of a paradox, because unlike the stable profitability, a small increase in profitability of grain crops and stronger growth in the profitability of oil seeds, which is driven by the growing prices on the international market, we see a huge growth in profitability in perennial crops. And if markets would work well, we would expect that the area and share of the perennial crops which become more profitable would increase. Moreover, those of you who know the trends in international trade of agricultural commodity will know that import of fruits and vegetables, that's the major item in imports. So we do have demands for fruits and vegetables in Ukraine. We would expect that growth in personal incomes would also stimulate further demand for fruits and vegetables, and that's why we should expect growth in production of perennial crops, which doesn't happen in Ukraine. Why it is so? Well, we make a hypothesis in this paper that crops that would require longer investments are more sensitive to the quality of property right protection. And that's why, uncertainty with the institutional arrangement actually may lead to underinvestment in this crop, and that's exactly what we test in this paper. Well, talking about the institutional arrangements and what is going on with the protection of property rights in Ukraine, I would like to make a reference first about the land reform that we had in Ukraine since the independence. So many of you know that before the independence, all the property, including land and agricultural enterprise, were belonged to the state, right? 100% was state. And in Ukraine started a land reform by providing part of the land and management of agriculture to employees of the farms, to so-called to collective property of those employees. And that's when the collective property for land and agricultural enterprises emerged in Ukraine, and it was the start of transition of the agricultural sector. Later on, in 1999 and later in 2001, Ukraine adopted several pieces of law that provided individuals with rights to withdraw their individual parcels or shares from these collective enterprises, and provided individuals with the rights to make decisions, different types of decisions about this property. However, at the same time, in 2001, the more cultural land providing the and the moratorium was initially established till 2005, and the expectations were that by 2005 we would develop the infrastructure for the land market. We would establish clear records that would support the property right for the market. But since then, the moratorium was extended already 5 times, if I'm not mistaken, and currently it is set to expire on January the 1st of 2016. But already we heard several references that it's going to be extended even further to 2018. And this fact by itself represents a major uncertainty about the opportunity of land users, tenants, and landowners about the extent they can utilize or their rights, various rights related to land. Just a couple of, let's see. Well, I will return to this point in a second, but during this period that I have just mentioned, I just want to illustrate that, well, in 1990, all land belonged to the state, then about 40% moved to collective property, and then with adoption of this new land code, collective property appeared, but the private property land emerged. Illustration. Well, going to uncertainty, because of these restrictions in the rights to sell land, the only means to exchange the land was through the rental market. So the rental market emerged, and it played the major role in the redistribution of land resources among the producers. On this graph, I have shown how the share of rental land increased since 2001 among various groups of producers. And you see the largest change was for the largest producers above 3,000 hectares. By now, about 95% that is operated by various producers is actually rented in. Well, going back to uncertainty, well, in more stable institutional environment, pretty much any form of tenure would provide this almost the same level of protection, but not in Ukraine. Because of unknown rules that would be established on the market after the moratorium is lifted, there are several items that are not known neither to the producers nor to the landowners. Whether the legal entities will be allowed to the sales market, whether they can buy. What would be the limits to the land holding for individual owners? Whether any preemptive rights will be established on the market. So these are just some of the items that were debated over the last 10 years regarding the design of the land market. And all these items represent the threats that both tenants and landowners should consider very carefully when making decisions about investment to land and about the level of protection that they would have over their investment. So the responses that we observe on the market to these factors of uncertainty is that the landlords, landowners prefer to have shorter contracts, and those of you who work with agriculture know that the average length of the rental agreements in Ukraine is between 4 and 5 years, right? Even though legally it could be up to 49 years with some recent changes, of course. But second, for tenants facing this uncertainty, the optimal strategy would be to underinvest, right, into any land-related projects. Again, to continue with some illustration of the previous points, over the last 10 years, more than 10 years, the share of rental land increased, but also the distribution of rental market changed slightly, starting from relatively low share and more equally distributed in the early 2000s to much higher share by 2011, and we start seeing this large increase in the share of rental contracts in the major producing areas of Ukraine. So the question that we address in this paper is, does this institutional uncertainty that we have just presented affects the investment decisions in Ukrainian agriculture? And again, we provide some results of some modeling in response to this question, but also with some empirical tests, we try to answer this question. So we use the case of Ukraine to test, to provide the answer to this question. So before we switch to the model, let's have a couple of more slides on what is Ukrainian agriculture, what is the structure of Ukrainian agriculture, so that we know which part of this sector we are taking for this, to answer the question above. So again, most of you know that we have two parts in agricultural sector. We have a large number of subsistence farms or household farms. Like we have about 5 million individual households with small plots that produce something primarily for the internal consumption or to have some supplementary income out of agricultural production. And that part of agricultural sector was not much affected by the institutional changes. They had their own plots, they cultivate them. The only change that we observed during the 90s is that people started to rely more on their own production as one of the coping strategies during the transition. The other part of agricultural sector is represented by the corporate farms. In Ukraine, we have close to 10,000 of large commercial farms. Some of them are way above 100,000 hectares. And we have about 35 to 40,000 small producers. Most of them are below 50 hectares. And again, the small producers, many of them operate on their own land that they received as during the process of privatization. But this is the largest producers that have to combine both their own land and rent in sufficiently large amount of land on the rental market to match the land input with their capacity to produce. So overall, about 17.5 million hectares is cultivated by these large producers, while the other two groups combined operate about 7 million hectares. And in terms of the total output, the state statistics of Ukraine provides reports on the output index for agricultural sector, and these two white lines represent the household production. So we see that the crop production increased over time, or almost doubled, but the output by a commercial farm actually dropped during the early years of transition to almost 50% of the initial level, but then it started recovering, but yet we haven't reached the level of production that we had in 1990. So for this paper, I will look specifically at the large commercial farms. That's the sector first that makes the largest impact which has the largest use of agricultural land in Ukraine and is largely affected by this institutional uncertainty. We use data for this paper. We use data provided by or collected regularly by the State Statistics Service of Ukraine, where there are regular statistical forms. The data is collected on universe of large producers on annual basis. So we have unbalanced panel with more than 100,000 observations, and all the monetary values we convert to the 2010 real US dollars for better comparison. So why the uncertainty and how the uncertainty should affect the investment decisions? That's the question that we face. And first, we try to approach this question from more theoretical point of view. And we explain this decision relying on the models developed for, first of all, urban investments. In this literature, we have several models that explain so-called switching point between keeping the land undeveloped and switching to development of land. So this decision is explained, first of all, by the net present value of income flow, either from non-developed versus the developed land. So at the point when the net present value of developed land starts increasing, the net present value of not developed land, the owners would consider switching or making the investment decisions. And in our case with agriculture, we consider land plots which are used for production of annual crops as non-developed, or land plots without investment, and land plots with perennial crops we consider as plots that used for investment. The net present value is affected by the size of the investment, by time trend, and by plot-specific productivity shocks. You can imagine that every single plot has its own characteristics, such as landscape, quality of soil, microclimate, and so on. So there are lots of factors that affect plot-specific productivity. The investor's decision is to maximize the net present value received from the plot by choosing the time for by choosing the optimal switching point. So in case we do have risk or uncertainty about the income flow from the investment, we may have to discount this revenue stream by the factor associated with the riskiness of this investment. And in our case, we consider that land that is rented in as being more risky than the land that is in the private ownership. And we test this hypothesis empirically, whether indeed the form of tenure makes any difference in terms of the investment decisions, in terms of the share of land used for different crops. So switching to the empirical model, in reality, we observe some distribution of this switching point for different plots, even within the single enterprise. Because of these plot-specific factors, we would observe both plots that are converted to perennials and plots that are not converted to perennial plots. So at the end, we would have the share of land used for different type of crops as a function of return to a particular crop, which is proxied with prices, the cost of capital, the riskiness factor, whether the land plot is rented in or privately owned, and plot-specific characteristics. We estimate this empirical model using the system of equations where the dependent variable, we use the share of perennial crops versus the share of grains and oilseeds. And we explain this share in terms of exposure to the risk proxied by the share of land rented in. We also include several controls to this model, which I will skip. And the hypothesis that we test in this paper is that, well, if there is no risk, no uncertainty about the institutional protection of property rights, the form of tenure should not have any impact on the investment decisions or on the share of crops, share of land under different crops, versus the alternative that the effect of land tenure on share of rental land should be more negative than the effect of rented land on annual crops. So that's the main hypothesis that we address in this paper. I will skip the descriptive statistics since I'm running out of time. We estimated this model with Tobit regressions since we have a sufficiently large number of observations being censored. And what we see that the share of rental land is negatively associated with the share of perennial crops at the level of individual producers. At the same time, we see that it is positively associated with the share of grains or share of oil, and when we take the difference between these two estimates and test for significance of these parameters across the models, we actually see that this difference is significant, and as you can imagine from these results, the effect of rental share is much more negative, has much more negative effect on perennial crops than on annual crops, which we treat as an evidence of lower security of property rights associated with the rental land. Since I run out of time, I will just browse through the results. We also test whether the effect of this unsecurity differs with respect to the farm size. And indeed, these are the smaller farms that are less protected or perceived to be less protected, and their investment decisions are affected much more than investment decisions of the larger farms. And you see the farms above 2,000 hectares are not affected much, but those below 2,000 hectares are negatively affected by unsecurity of property rights. So that's the comparison with annual crops. We also try to estimate the practical significance of these results. So we compared the change in production of perennial crops that we observe over the last about 10 years. We observe the drop in the land used for this crop and the share of land used for this crop. And when we compare, which is about 43,000 hectare drop, and when we compare this change with the estimated effect of the rental land on the choice of crop, we see that the estimated effect very close to the observed effect, which we interpret that almost all decrease in production of perennial crops is explained by the low level of security of property rights. That's it in terms of results. In terms of conclusions and policy recommendations, we see that uncertainty about the level of protection leads to underinvestment, and we would say not only to specifically perennial crops, but any long-term capital-intensive projects such as dairy, livestock, greenhouses, irrigation, and so on, that affects negatively the value added per hectare that we may generate, and the small farms are affected much more than the large one, and we would strongly support finalizing the land reforms in Ukraine, opening the land market, improving the cadastral registry records that would increase the level of protection of property rights, and that, in our opinion, would lead to high investment, high agricultural output, and higher productivity growth in this important sector of Ukrainian agriculture. Thank you very much. I will be happy to answer your questions.
All right, thank you. Our discussant is Oleg Badunenko. Unfortunately, because of family constraints, he couldn't come, but at this day and age, it doesn't matter. I come from the Silicon Valley. You don't have to come to work. You can work from home. Oleg had a tape recording of his presentation, and so we're going to see a movie of him discussing the paper. You can see there.
Don't let this go too far, because then all of us will have to sit at home.
Yeah, it's Hollywood here.
Hello everyone, my name is Oleg Badunenko. I'm going to discuss the paper, the presentation of which you have just heard. And this way of discussing is, of course, very tricky, because I have received this paper a couple of weeks ago, and the authors, in the meantime, could have addressed many of the issues I'm going to raise right now. So I would like to apologize in advance for this. I'm just going to start. So first I'm going to say what this paper was to me about, and then I'm going to speak about the conceptual and empirical issues that I have with the paper. This paper investigates how uncertainty regarding property rights influences the activities in the agricultural sector in Ukraine, and authors consider investment, land use, and crop mix. Let me start with conceptual issues that I have with the paper. And it all starts with an introduction where authors refer to share of agricultural sector in GDP as potential in the sector, which is not as we know it. Further, they say that the share has declined, and we know that during this time everything has declined. So this decline does not necessarily mean that the actual size or the absolute size has also declined. Let me now have an issue with an index of agricultural output, and this is a solid line in their figure 1. I'm not really sure how it has been constructed. The output of household, which uses about 2/3 of the agricultural land, has shot up, and commercial use has only halved, so I'm not really sure how the total index has fallen, so much more clarification on this is going to be necessary. And the second issue that is seen on this graph is that there is clearly a substitution of output by commercial enterprises by that of households, and it's not been discussed at all. You're talking about the productivity and how it evolves, but the numbers for tendency of productivity are missing. And I also have a feeling that you're using index of output and productivity interchangeably, and they're clearly two different things. You're saying restoring, and what you really want to say actually is that the way to make a leapfrog or the major progress to help the world food problem. You're mentioning a report where literacy rate of Ukrainian people is about 99%, and this is very pleasant to know, but I think it has not a particular interest for agricultural sector in particular. And you're saying that there are several cases that confirm adaptation of new technologies. I would like to see citation for that. You mentioned that Ukraine is a very urbanized country, and I would like to see as a reader the numbers that somehow compares it to other countries or explain what it means, and especially in a relation that it's not going to harm the whole population if agricultural sector is increased. At the end of the introduction, you're suddenly talking about the importance of property right protection and haven't said a word before that. So you just want to have would like to have a discussion about that before. Here comes my major conceptual issue. And here you, as far as I understand, you're analyzing only 1/3 of all land that is used for agriculture. But the rest 2/3 is very important. And as we have seen in graph 1, it seems to be a very good substitute for commercial output. So what happens is this 2/3 is clearly constant over time. So the increase in commercial output, if anything, should matter only for export. So here is my bottleneck argument. Country needs for domestic consumption only so much. So any increase in commercial output should matter only for export. The export story is very interesting, especially given that you're talking about the Ukraine that will help the World Food Program, but it is completely missing in your paper. So exports should necessarily be discussed here. Let me now turn to the major argument that you have. And here I took the liberty of transferring the numbers in table 2 to time series lines. On the right panel, on the right axis, you see the profits. On the left axis, you see the output per hectare. And it seems that over time, the technology of perennial crops have increased greatly by about 300%, by about 200%, threefold. While for oil, it is almost 78%, and for grain, only 10%. And given that the prices were approximately the same in real terms, it means that the profitability has been going hand in hand with this productivity. Now what we see in this graph, this solid line represents the perennial, is that production of this type of crop uses completely different technology from the rest of the crops. Now let's now turn to table 1, where we see the land in acres or in hectares, which is used for different types of crops, and the solid line, the blue one, represents the perennial area, which is almost constant, but this is because the scale is very, very small. When we look at the red line, it has been declining by about 20%. And you immediately say that the primary source for that is uncertainty in institutional changes. But I see a completely different storyline here, given the previous slide. Right, we have seen this very steep increase in technology, and given the bottleneck argument that I have mentioned before, that country needs only so much, the perennial crop has just saturated the market, and so no more has been necessary. So the area that has been used for cultivating perennial crop has just been decreased. So that's all for me. And I haven't seen any discussion of it, so you have just pulled the uncertainty argument. So much more discussion would be necessary down here. And I also have a question. The sum of shares in table 1 is about 50 to 75%. So I wonder what is the rest type of crop is out there. Now regarding the property rights. In Ukraine, the unclear transaction procedures are very common in the entire economy. So is it in some way exclusive for agriculture? Is it worse or better? Is there any empirical evidence for that? The second issue is that you're mentioning regulation and uncertainty, and these two are completely different, but difference is not clear from the text. For example, the minimum of 7 years is the regulation, it's not an uncertainty. And you can imagine that in developed countries, there are numerous regulations, They're not uncertainties, so these are just constraints that businesses have to live with. So you have to clearly distinguish between uncertainty and regulation in the text. Now, regarding the hypothesis that you're testing, you say that there are two types of use of land, on owned and unrented, and there are two types of crops, annual and perennial. You argue that annual is more safer than perennial, and then of course own is much safer than rented. So what you're actually dealing with is that you're going to ask the question whether safer 2 is actually better investment strategy than riskier one. Given that you want to compare the long and short-term perspective, I think you would actually be interested in testing whether safer 1 is really better than riskier 1. Is it true? Or whether safer 2 is really better than riskier 2. You cite numerous reports, but scientific citations are actually very scarce. So I would really like to see in revised paper many more scientific citations. Let me now turn to econometrical, empirical issues, and I'm going to start with specification. To me, return is a crop price less an investment. And given that investment varies by crop, it's large for perennial and small for annual crops, price is going to be really bad proxy for return. Second issue, you're mentioning that number of lags for different types of crop can be different. There is a possibility for you to test it using your regression analysis. Third, justifying the using a fixed effect, you're saying the cost of investment is going to be about the same for farms, but I think it's going to vary also by crop type. So it is something you should take into account. Then you're mentioning that similar and related estimation provides efficiency gains, and it really is so. But given that you have identical regressors, GLS is not beating OLS anymore. And my major question is, you have a panel data, you have a very, very wide panel data, you have a very short one, you have a lag-dependent variable, so why not use panel data and dynamic panel data in particular? When you're using OLS, there is a well-known nickel bite because you have a fixed effects in your specification, so the result that you're getting might or are biased, right? So at least some discussion is necessary in this respect. The other big specification issue I have is that risk is not linear. Up to some threshold, there is a certain risk, but when you have more rented land than some threshold, then of course risk is going to be much, much greater. So what I was thinking about is that you can generate a dummy variable where rent is larger than half, and you can use it instead of rent continuous variable. Or you can get two dummy variables differentiating between three types of risk. You can think about other ways of modeling, but the risk is definitely not linear. Let me now talk about the interpretational issues. You're mentioning combined difference, but you're not explaining what's meant by that. Can you say this is a learn to multiply, but it's only just 3 years? So you have to put some label on it before you're using term combined difference. Is it statistically different? Is it statistically significant? You're mentioning only first to third regression, but then you have so many of them. Is it statistically significant for all specifications that you have? Now regressions 10 to 12, you're running excluding the small forms, and you say the numbers are different now. The question is, are they statistically different? And what you could do is you could get a dummy for smaller firms, interacted with everything, with main variables, and then use a wall test to test this hypothesis. Now, the last paragraph on page 16 is very interesting, but to me it is forced by the regression analysis that you're running. Suppose you have the first and the second equation here, numbers 1 and 2, and these are exactly the first and one that you have there. The difference between these two is going to be the difference in shares between perennial and annual share, and then going to be rent times the difference in coefficients, the slope coefficients in front of rent. Now, since share annual is about constant, this is what you get from the data. Look at the table 1. If you write out this equation 3 for 2 time periods, the change in share of perennial crops is going to be given by the difference in coefficients times the rent, and this is exactly what you're getting. So the conclusion that you're getting here, it's not a data-driven, it's regression-driven. So there's no surprise in that. Now let me turn to the major interpretational issue. First of all, let's remind ourselves what has to be tested, and the null hypothesis that more uncertainty or fewer property rights lead to less investment. What your analysis shows is that the larger portion of rental lands leads to smaller share of investment-hungry crop. These two hypotheses and conclusions are not the same. And again, if you recall the bottleneck argument, the share of perennial crops is negligible, and smaller share of this investment-hungry crop does not necessarily imply that there has been less investment on average for each and every firm. So I really question the conclusion that you have, that you actually have tested the hypothesis, the null hypothesis that you wanted to test. And finally, referring to the page 18 of the paper where you have the what-if analysis, it's very interesting. I'm very fond of such analysis. And you come up with a staggering number of $43 million per year. And this is a huge sum of money. But this number is a result of an assumption that sharing perennial crop would have increased from 0.5% to 25%. And this really is a huge increase. Right? So the conventional analysis cannot be done on such differences, because you would necessarily have many more players and they will underprice. So there wouldn't be such a profitability difference as it is right now. So you might think about presenting this figure by just mentioning caveats associated with it, or just say that profitability probably would decrease. So I thank you for your attention.
Okay, I suggest Denis tape records his response and send it to Oleg, and now we'll collect questions. Questions? Yes, Oleg.
Yeah.
Oleg Haverlishin, very nice paper. The impressive, stuff and analysis. I don't agree with all of the. Sorry.
It's on.
Oh, I'm not using it right. Thank you. Very nice paper. Very impressive analysis and interpretation and so forth. I disagree with some of the things that were said by the commentator. I have one very small comment. Your list of the major 10 crops. Amazing how close the list of the Greek geographer Strabo in 124 BC was about the exports from what was not then Ukraine to Greece and the Mediterranean, honey, wax, grains. He also had furs and freshwater fish, but amazing how close it is. So it's constancy of Ukraine's breadbasket role. On the substance of your work, I'm missing, and maybe I'm misunderstanding something, but I'm missing the issue of investments that also need to be done in grain crops. I mean, they're not small. Okay, now I'm not suggesting what you have done is misguided or incorrect, but I wonder if that affects things as well, and it's a different way of putting the question. In fact, it may, you know, some of the investments that you have to do in grain crops, like storage and transport, and of course a much bigger machinery cost than for perennial crops, are really not just one-year investments at all. So they are comparable to perennial crop investment. Thank you.
Is it okay? Well, first of all, I would like to thank the reviewer, and as I mentioned, this is a work in progress, so many things that we have actually done probably are not written well enough, so I take the critique, and we have to address more clearly many of the concerns that were raised by the reviewer. Oleg, thank you very much for your question. Indeed, both annual and perennial crops would require investments, and our hypothesis was based on the difference between the effect of less secure rental land on the investment between these two crops. I'm not saying that there is no effect. Right. And probably in addition, well, to support our estimation strategy is that many investment in annual crops, the longer term investments, are sort of more flexible in terms of the attachment to the specific land plot. So well, and many of us know that investment in machinery, well, particular set of machinery is used not only on the plot, even in one rayon, but the fleet is moving from the southern part to the northern part with the season, and the storage can be used not only for the crops from a particular land plot, but can provide service to, well, so we do have a little bit more flexibility with investments in annual crop, or not plot-specific investment, rather than with investment into the land quality or land improvements on a particular crop, like we have with perennial crops, with irrigation, with greenhouses. So that would be my response. But thank you for bringing this point. I would probably add a little bit more explanation that would address your comment. Thank you.
Questions? I have a question. When firms have to deal with this uncertainty about crops, do you see any difference in terms of responses across different types of ownership? For example, we say that we want to attract foreign direct investment into agriculture. Do you see that they have the same issues with perennial versus annual crops?
Well, we observe, thank you for your question, we observe over the last 10 years a decline in growing perennial crops overall, and particularly in the larger farms, the land is converted to the oilseed production. But what we start observing over the recent years, that more and more of small farmers start growing their new orchards, which well, and most of them cultivate their own land plots, 5 hectares, 6 hectares, which, well, at this point, I cannot speculate on that, because in the data we do not have plot-specific data on ownership. We have the overall size of the land holding and the size of the rented land, without specific whether the annual or perennial crops are growing on this rented land. But what we observe as the anecdotal evidence would suggest that, you know, some investments take place into perennial crops. Well.
One more question.
Building on this question of investments in annual crops, it seems to me that as I understand these things, these are not only storage facilities and so forth, but it could also determine the mix of crops you grow every year, and whether, for example, you put land aside whether you put it fallow, whether you plant a certain crop that doesn't make as much money but replenishes the land. It seems to me if you had less secure tenure, you would go for exploiting the land as fast as you could and just keep growing corn or keep growing wheat. And I wonder if that might be another possibility of examining how that allocation of land might change with the security of tenure.
Well, thank you. Well, that's exactly the line for our next paper that we are developing. But not only this, but also the use of fertilizer. So the short-term investments could also be affected by the security of property rights. But we started with the longer-term investments. We're moving to the short-term investments.
All right. Thanks very much. Lunch is outside. Thanks for coming.